Okay. Hi, Rick.
Hey, Josh.
Welcome to the Explorer Poet podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, as we were discussing just before we jumped in, I found you through Twitter, actually, and now I guess it's called X. I found you through X and started just looking into some of the work that you do. I visited your website and I saw kind of what you were about, and so I reached out because I thought uh, that a lot of the things that you're into, a lot of the psychology and the inner lives of men and things that men deal with. I think it's an interesting topic just in our modern society. There's this really interesting thing going on around the balance between masculinity, femininity, men, women, and so I just wanted to give you a chance to come on and talk about some of the things that you look into and some of the experiences that you've had, things that you've learned. And then, after we got to exchanging emails, you brought up this other point around men and the mother wound. And so I'd really love to dive into all of this with you. But maybe really quickly, you could just give me a little bit of a background of who you are, how you got involved with this, and how long you've been doing it and what exactly it is that you do.
Those are all good questions. So I first became involved in what people commonly refer to as men's work back when I was about 28 or 29. I had been struggling a lot in my 20s. I had finished college eventually, and I got a computer science degree, so I was working in information technology. It didn't really suit my interests or my temperament, but I needed to make money. And it was really like hard, difficult environments, corporate environments. And I could not keep a relationship going for very long with a woman. And my friends were all getting married. So all the party scene was just kind of dying off. And I wound up partying a lot by myself, which I didn't like very much. And I was starting to have some health issues too, because I had no idea how to take care of myself. I work 80 hours. I'd party the rest of the time. I'd sleep whenever I slept. And, I didn't exercise. I didn't know how to eat right, nothing. And so everything just seemed to be kind of collapsing on me. Um, and then I had a breakup right before Thanksgiving one year that just absolutely eviscerated me. And I got to the end of the year and I said, boy, you know what? I'm going to find somebody to help me because I have to. And in my family system, you don't do that. You don't go outside the family. You don't ask anybody for help. You certainly don't go to a therapist or a counselor. But I just made that commitment to myself, and within the first month, I saw an interview with someone here in Austin, where I live, who specialized in what he called men's work, and he told a little bit of his story, and I thought, wow, that sounds an awful lot like mine. So I called him and did some individual sessions with him, and then he said, hey, I've got a group, a men's group, and I'd like you to come. I think it would help you. And it's like, you got to be kidding me, man! I can barely tell one person anything. Um, but he kind of kept at it, and I started going, and it was very odd at first, but I found it extremely helpful to hear from what was really happening with other men, as opposed to the things that I talked about with my friends, or they talked about with me, or coworkers, or whatever. And that's how I got started. And so that was in the late '80s, and very quickly, I really felt like the thing that I want to do. I want to do what that guy's doing. I want to be able to help men. Um, and then my creativity was very stifled. I wound up writing a poetry book. And then the process just kind of continued for about 30 years. And eventually I felt like I had enough confidence in what I knew. And I ran into someone who could help me basically get started. And I started coaching. And I primarily coach men. I do some coaching with women, but my primary demographic for coaching is men. And there are a number of issues that we tend to focus on. One of which is this mother wound issue that you brought up. And so that's kind of the quickest way I can put it, I guess.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I think that a lot of what you say resonates with me as far as the type of family you grow up in, but also the broader idea of what men are and what types of subjects men are allowed to approach, it seems
Hmm.
like it seems like or it seems as if the world expects men to be much more extroverted, meaning that they expect men to go handle things that are outside of themselves, to be in charge
Hmm.
of providing, protecting, these kind of things. But for whatever reason, it seems that men are not supposed to turn inward.
Right.
And then, like you were saying, you had a group of male friends or male colleagues, people around you who you obviously you can connect with in certain ways. And usually with men, that's by shared interests, which is going to
Right.
be activities, sports, movies, whatever it is, doing things that are
Work.
fun, work, yeah, accomplishing some kind of external goal. But just finding that you aren't able to turn inward. And the other interesting thing you said about that is, given your experience in the corporate world, I had a very similar experience where I went into the corporate world, and even there, you want to have this expression, you want to be able to say things, do things, help in ways that that if that the corporate world could probably benefit from, but really isn't looking for from men. Um, and then just that inner search for that inner commitment, because you went against the norm, you went against what your culture was doing, you went against your family,
Hmm.
the family norm. When you say coaching, I am curious, what does coaching look like, and what type of situations are you helping men through, or what type of men are coming to you for coaching?
I get I get all kinds of men. A lot of professionals, a lot of men who've done very well in the externals that you talk about in life, but their inner life is lagging behind. And so the number one thing that I find needs attention, which turned out to be the number one thing I found with myself that needed attention in the men that come to me, is that their relationship with themselves is underdeveloped, I'll say. A lot of times when I ask a man, well, tell me about your relationship with yourself, he's like, I have no idea what you're talking about, And I would have been the same way. So that's a fundamental kind of foundational core thing that I work on with everybody, men and women. But one of the things I see a lot with men, particularly men that are successful, in the business world, in their profession, uh, however you want to put it, uh, they often find it difficult to bring the skill set that they have in their professional lives into their personal life. So, for example, I'll get men who are married and they are assertive and they're on top of things in their work environment, but in their home environment, they have a really hard time saying what they want or saying what they need or negotiating. For example, if there's a difference of opinion or if there are different values or there are different priorities, they can't really translate the skill set that they have in their professional lives over into their personal lives, and it causes them a lot of frustration. And one of the reasons I think for that is kind of along the lines of what you're saying earlier. There are certain environments where men are encouraged and expected and allowed to be clear and assertive and show leadership and show decisiveness, and those tend to be the work environments. uh, in the home environment or in the personal lives of men, whether they're married a lot or not, there's often not really a sort of feeling that it's okay to access that part of themselves. And honestly, most of the men that come to me came out of family backgrounds like mine or like yours, where perhaps they saw a father or experienced a father who either abused his power and caused all kinds of carnage, emotionally, psychologically, and physically in the family, or a father who was just really withdrawn and wasn't really sure of himself. So they never saw an example or they never had a model of a man who's connected to his masculine power in a responsible way that benefits everybody.
Yeah, in a kind of a healthy, balanced masculinity. Because the way that I experienced it, or the way that I've seen it, is what you're talking about. Either they're too aggressive or they're not aggressive enough. They're either too aggressive or they're passive. And what it looks like actually is that take, for example, something that I saw a lot in my life is a very passive man who doesn't stand up for himself over and over and over and over, to the point that when he does stand up for himself, it's always a big explosion. It's always
Yes.
taken way too far.
Right. Right. Not balanced, not clear, often kind of contaminated
Right.
by the backlog that built it up.
Yeah.
And in my situation, my father was terrifying. So I learned to step very carefully. And no matter how carefully I step, something bad was going to happen to me eventually anyway. And so I knew I couldn't please him, even though I dearly wanted to. And so I basically turned all my attention over to my mother and keeping her happy, which caused me additional problems because I
Right.
had no model of, in terms of a father, I had no model of a responsible exercise of and discrete exercise of masculine power and authority. And on the other hand, I learned to basically subvert my masculine power even as a kid because I was deferring to my mother. So that set up a situation where I was a very angry man in my late 20s and in my early 30s, and that was the very first issue that I learned with this gentleman and his partner, his therapy partner who ran the groups. That was the very first thing I had to tackle, and I didn't want to be angry. I was scared. I was scared to get into it because I was like, man, if that I'll just destroy the whole town, if that starts to come out of me, and I'll get stuck in it and I'll never come out. Um, so that was kind of the first layer of the archaeological project. The very first layer that had to come off was the anger. And of course, I'm sure you're aware, anger is often a protective layer around grief, sadness, shame, abandonment, all that kind of anxiety, all that kind of stuff. So the anger part was actually the easy part, and that's what kind of got me started, and just that's one of the hardest things that I deal with male clients is they start to get in touch with their anger and they're like, well, what do I do with this? And we don't have good sort of options for everyday people to express their anger physically in a healthy way. I don't know if they're still going on. There was this little trend of rage rooms around the country for a little while. I don't know if they're still going, but I thought that was a great idea. So there should be one of those about every 3 blocks,
Yeah.
and those things that's the deal. There is you reserve time. You put a helmet on, you put your pads on, and you go in there and you just destroy everything in the room. And it's like, okay, fine. And you go home. So I think that's an ongoing problem that we have just in general in the society, particularly for men, because if a man can't experience and express that emotional energy that we label as anger in a healthy, functional way, then he's also blocking his access to his masculine power because the anger just kind of sits on top of it, and actually nothing can get through. But grief can't get through either.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually, the way that I did it when I came across this same idea is I do a lot through exercise. Like exercise really helps me burn it out.
Yeah.
But I also, there was a point in my life where I was just jumping on a kayak and going as far out into this big reservoir as I could where nobody was around and just screaming as loud as I could
There you
and
go.
just getting it
Yeah.
out. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And exercise is a great thing. So whether it's running, cycling, swimming, weights, handball, whatever you do. But the thing I always tell people is that the sort of limitation on that is it's all two-dimensional, right? It's very linear. And that energy that wants to come up is not necessarily linear. It's a more of a three-dimensional energy that kind of swirls around and stuff. So one of the best things I found for a lot of men is to join a boxing gym.
Mm.
Uh, that works really well for them because you can hit the bag, and that's somewhat two-dimensional, but you can move around. You get your legs, you get your body moving and stuff. But anytime if you have any sort of wilderness area available to do like what you talked about, that can be real helpful because it's a primal energy
Yeah.
that should have its place in our lives, but we're so civilized that we've basically driven it underground, which creates all kinds of other problems.
Yeah, it really did feel primal. It felt like, well, also, growing up in a house similar to yours, it felt like I couldn't have a voice. If I stated what I was feeling, then I would be punished for it, even though it
Correct.
wasn't me that was putting this emotion on myself. I was the
Right.
child, you know? But so just going out to somewhere where I could use my voice and I could use it as loud as I wanted and it wasn't going to affect anybody else, that was a big part of it, was just letting it come out of through my vocal cords.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and to really open it up and express it. And again, a lot of people they live in neighborhood settings, they live in apartments. So I do work with men on different ways to do that, and I could talk more at length about some of the ways that I found to do it. Um, but that is, that's one of the biggest challenges that so many men face, and it's important to be able to find some way to deal with it strategically, right? A lot of what I work on with men is strategy and options, strategy and options, because so much of what frustrates men, and it frustrated me, was we feel like we're sort of trapped in a pattern and we keep getting the same results and we don't understand why. And if we knew what to do, we'd do something else. But the whole process of understanding a pattern while you're in the middle of it, or especially if you're at the beginning of it, and be able to slow things down and just kind of break it down and determine at which points you actually have choices, but you don't know it. That's a lot of the work that I do, because our existence is so patterned, whether it's thinking, behaving, perceiving, acting, deciding. We tend to just sort of like do the same things over and over again. And I think it's important as a life skill to be able to develop the ability to notice in the moment, when even if you still do the same thing you always did, at least notice. It's like, there's a choice point here, and I still feel compelled to do that thing, but now I'm starting to be aware. It's like, I don't necessarily have to do that thing. I could do something else. And if you do something else, it still might not work. But you get some information that you never get if you just continue in the default.
Yeah. And even if you can just first recognize the pattern, and then
Mhm.
while you're not in that triggered state, you're not in the pattern, just sit and think about it. Think about the last time you experienced it and think about how you acted. And then for me, simply saying, okay, I'm aware of the pattern. And then if something triggers me, I can then just have a mechanism that triggers myself another direction to just observe what's happening. Meaning,
Right.
meaning that when I feel that emotion coming up, I can have, it's like if you tell yourself before it happens, and then as it starts to happen, it's hard to not actually remember that you told yourself, oh, this is going to happen. And then once you've got that reminder, it's you have to, it's about ownership at that point, about saying, am I going to allow myself to unconsciously go through this pattern, or am I going to remember that I am aware of this pattern and I'm going to be in control of myself.
And when you're aware of it and you do it anyway, then you start to make contact with some parts inside you that are not necessarily adults.
Right. Yes. Oh man, that's a good segue into this mother wound topic, which I want to jump into. There's one other thing I wanted to say though, because you were talking earlier about, I just want to go back real quick and then we'll jump into mother wounds. But you were talking about men at work and how when you're at work, you are rewarded for being assertive, for, in a lot of ways, it's about being competitive, because
Yes.
every business is a competitive environment, and it's not even implicit, it's just explicitly stated that we're trying to win. And um, the big difference may be that when you come home, this is not only not an explicitly competitive environment, it shouldn't even be an implicitly competitive environment. It should be more about a cooperative environment. And
Right.
we were talking, you mentioned that you had looked at the downloadable that I have on my website called Myth. It's called Myth for Modern Men. And in
Mhm.
that, I talk about games. And so the way that I think about a lot of things that humans do, the things that we experience, I see them as games. And so it's really easy to look at a job or the company itself as a piece of a bigger game that is called the economy. And
Right.
so it's this thing that has been invented to benefit people. And it's a
Mhm.
game that we play. And if we play it well, we get some kind of a reward, whether that's a salary or status, or, if you're really fortunate and you play a game, the economic game well, you can have wealth, financial wealth. But in a real way, relationships are a similar thing because it's two people trying to figure something out together. So in a way, it is a game. It's just a different type of game where the home environment is not inherently competitive. It should be a little bit more cooperative. And so in a work environment, I think men are geared towards that competitive nature. And, I also talk about this in my write-up. If you go far enough back in history, the economy is a game that men invented for men to play. And only recently are we starting to see women join that game. And I think that's a big part of why it's so difficult, or why there's a lot to discover there, because men have been playing the game for so long, and only now are they sharing the game with women. But the home environment for the longest time has been more about a game designed by women. And so it can be difficult for a man to go there and know their role in the game. And what I found is that, even though it's not competitive, it is, at least like you were saying, it is important to bring some of those skill sets home, because while it's not a competitive game necessarily, you're not competing with your spouse, your partner, but together you are trying to achieve something. There is a goal. And so it is important to bring some of those skill sets home: communication, assertiveness, some analysis, some, a lot of times just being willing to do some work yourself.
Yeah. And negotiation as well. And boundary setting, right? So a lot of men, not all, but a lot of men in professional environments, particularly if they're very successful, they're very good at setting boundaries in a professional environment. They know where their responsibilities begin and end. They know what they're capable of accomplishing and what's too much. They know when someone comes in from another department and says, "Hey, I need you to do this." It's like, well, my team doesn't do that. It seems more clear cut in those situations, where I think a lot of men have challenges when it comes to setting boundaries in the home, uh, depending upon what they saw when they were children. Because again, my father was a nightmare to live with, but he was good at his job, and so I understood that that's a value. That's a masculine value that I picked up from him, which is like, work and be good at what you do. That's a positive, but that doesn't help me in my personal life.
Yeah, not unless you can take some of those skills and translate it into a different style or a different approach.
Or different contexts.
Yeah, different contexts.
Yeah, where they, as you said, some of them have more value in the personal context, and some of them you have to be very discreet.
Yeah.
About how you exercise that.
Yeah, and oftentimes at home, kind of going back to what you had said earlier, as a young boy, you were fearful of your father. I have a similar experience where either my father was distant or I was scared of him. Right. And then, so you turn your energy then to your mother, to keeping your mother happy, because there's no way of pleasing this man, of right. of making him satisfied with your behavior. But a mother is different, and she will reward you differently. And so let's jump into this idea of the mother wound and where this stems from. And, when you reached out, you had said you listened to this other podcast that I had done with my friend Jen, and we talked about this movie, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And in that conversation, before we jumped in, I was just explaining how there are different ways of reading stories. And one of the things that our society likes to do is read stories literally. And so a lot of times when people go watch a movie, for example, they'll watch the movie and then they'll come away from it kind of just satisfied that they understand what the story was about. They understand, okay, this was about a superhero who fought a bad guy and the good guys won and the bad guys lost. Okay, we're all happy. But I think that there's actually multiple ways of reading stories. And one of the ways that pretty much how I see all stories now is to almost look at them as if they're dreams. And so when you look at a dream, the dreamer is the dream and is also in the dream. And so you become these multiple layers. where if you're
Mhm.
dreaming and there are characters popping up in your dreams, in some way, those characters actually represent a part of you. And
Right.
so when we go see a movie, we go read a book, we listen to stories, we can start to see that each piece in that story is a part of us. And so one of the stories that I referenced was Peter Pan. And I think um, when people read Peter Pan literally, they think it's a fun story about never growing up and always getting to be a child and living in a place where there's magic and you fight pirates and it's like fun. It's like a fun game. But I don't think that that's actually why Peter Pan is culturally significant. And I don't think it's why so many people connect to the story. I think that from a psychological perspective, Peter Pan as a story represents all of us because we have a piece of us inside of us that can't grow up because there's some authoritarian figure who's not allowing that piece to grow up.
Mhm.
And I see it as, it's really in the line that you sent over from I guess I'm repeating myself now, but in this podcast, I just noted that when you watch Peter Pan, it's a story about lost boys, and the boys are lost, and they actually explicitly state why they're lost boys, and it's because they don't have mothers.
Right.
And I see us as a society that there's a lot of lost boys because we don't actually have mothers, and the way that you have phrased this, and you wrote this article for the Huffington Post, is you phrased it as the mother wound.
Right.
And so
Right.
I want to turn it over to you and help us understand what this mother wound is and how does it originate and why is it that it affects men in such a way?
Good. So I'm actually going to read the first paragraph of that article because I want to get this right,
Yeah.
so that it's as clear as possible for people. So here's how I started it off. A mother wound may be thought of as an injury to the psyche of a child resulting from significant dysfunction or disruption in relationship with the mother. In some cases, it is the result of a mother's absence or unavailability due to death, illness, adoption, or other circumstances that dramatically separate the child from the mother. But more typically, a mother wound is a complex of injuries to the child's psyche received over many years, often as a result of the mother acting consciously or not out of her own woundedness. So there's this concept people like to throw around. I think it's a pretty good term of the idea of a good enough mother. Basically, you're not going to get the ideal. Nobody's going to get that. But was your relationship with your mother good enough to move you through the developmental stages from childhood through adolescence into adulthood, so that you don't get stuck somewhere, as I think you referenced just a minute ago. And the other thing that I added here to this description is one of the most severe kinds of psychic wounding occurs when the child's primary function in the relationship is to be used by the mother to meet her own narcissistic needs. Now, that doesn't mean that we're always talking about a woman who would be diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder. I mean, we all have narcissistic needs. If we don't, we can't get anything from anybody. And we have needs from other people, and we have needs in life. The issue here is, is the mother so wounded and so damaged in her own way because of what she didn't get growing up that it turns into a deficiency situation for the child. And so in my particular case, um, my mother's concept of who I was very limited. And if I didn't conform and stay within those constraints, it caused her a lot of discomfort. Uh, Now, when I was little, and I was the first one that was born, so I was what people refer to as the golden child. I was the first one. And I was a tremendous source of uh, pride and satisfaction for her. I was just a little kid. I didn't know that that was going on. But as more children came into the family, I got pushed farther and farther out. And then as I got older and more autonomous, I became a lot less interesting and a lot more problematic for her. So part of my mother wound is I had a mother who could not allow me to be who I was. She had a fixed idea of who I was and who I should be that met her needs. But she was not able to expand that out to allow me to be who I was in total. And of course, that became more and more evident as I got farther and farther into adulthood, and it began to be more and more painful to me that I was clearly not the character in her story that she wanted me to be.
Yeah. Well, first, just for you, I mean, I know you've acknowledged this for years now, but for you to say that out loud is a big step in anybody's development as far as coming to terms with what actually took place in their childhood versus what they thought was taking place.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this part of me that always, I get this every now and then when people hear me say something or they see something that I wrote, where they simply acknowledge that my ability to say these things out loud means that I've been through a lot. And so I just want to, share that same sentiment with you. Just the fact that you can say these things aloud, I'm aware that you've been through a lot. And
Thank you.
I guess it's, I have a lot of gratitude for people who are willing to not only go there themselves, but then share it with other people. I had a very similar childhood, like a very similar upbringing. And just going back to what you were saying about narcissism, even with a mother who is narcissistic, because you were saying not everything is narcissistic or diagnosable as a condition.
In my opinion, I'm not a psychotherapy professional. I'm speaking from my own experience and my own observation and my own research. But yeah, I don't think it's an on or off switch where it's like either somebody's like, clinically narcissistic or they're not. I think there's a big span of behavior. And I think some of that is situational. I think I think people will tend to be more narcissistic in certain types of situations and certain types of relationships,
Right.
but not necessarily across the board.
Right. And and all I wanted to bring up was how you said that that narcissism is typically a response to unmet needs from their own childhood. And so narcissism, when it reaches a point where it's affecting a mother's children, that narcissism in the mother is actually unprocessed trauma that she carries. And so it's a challenging situation because for someone like me, someone like you who is willing to look at their childhood and acknowledge the things that happened, and particularly the things that were not available to us, like you're describing your mother not allowing you to be you.
Right.
It's a painful situation because you can now look and you can probably, I guess I'm just assuming you can do this because of how much you're willing to talk about it. But I can see in my own mother the situation that created the trauma that she then passed on to her children. And it's very painful because I can see it in a clinical way where I can, I've grieved my own trauma to a point where I can talk about it.
Right.
But there's no part of her that's capable of doing that.
That's important.
Yeah. And so
it's very important to realize and accept that.
Yeah. And so part of it at some level, I guess we could say it's part of it is a choice. And part of that choice though is to remain unconscious. And so it's
Right.
I guess I'm just trying to say that it's a tricky situation because for me, I've already got to the point where I can acknowledge it, but this other person can't acknowledge it. And so I often feel stuck myself.
Well, and there's a series of challenge points, right, when you're dealing with this stuff. And one of them is the situation you described where it's like, okay, I've worked through a lot. I feel like I have a clear view of who this person is. And a lot of that is about getting out of enmeshment. So many of us come out of our childhood situations. A lot of men come out very enmeshed with their mothers. Like there's no sense that there are two autonomous, separate individuals there. And a lot of the time we don't know it. I remember when I did some really heavy work for months on my mother wound / my relationship with my mother about, I don't know, 7 years ago. And so much grieving was involved because I had to tell myself and accept, not just here, but all the way down inside now, I'm never going to have the mother I want. Never.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's still like, I'm like, oh, what? You know, even after all that work. But that was sort of a core. There were two things that were at the core of it. Um, I ran across some stuff on a website about narcissistic mothers. And after kind of exploring the website, I went to one page, and the very first sentence was, now that you understand that you have a narcissistic mother. And I just burst into tears. It was like, whoa, you know, it just was the right information at the right time. And that's what started the process. And after I'd been at it for a little while, I was out walking in the park down the street one day, and all of a sudden I had this like really deeply felt experience of like, wow, we're two separate people. And I didn't know that I did not have that sense and that understanding in myself. I was so enmeshed. I was so enmeshed with her that I didn't, somewhere inside me at a very fundamental place, I did not understand that we were two separate people. Um, and so you go through this work and then you say, okay, well, what kind of relationship can I have with this person? Um, and that was, you know, one of the fundamentals for me is I just had to go out of contact with her for a while, because I knew I had to get some distance from the way that I used to conceptualize it. Even though I was conceptualizing it in a different way, I knew it hadn't like sunk all the way down. Um, and then there were some circumstances. She was diagnosed with a terminal cancer. And at that point, I decided, okay, I'm not going to stay away from her and let her die without having any kind of interaction with her. But I was very strategic about the way that I went back into it. You know, I set boundaries. I I buffered the information that came from her. I told myself, you don't have to answer that email today. You don't feel like it, answer it tomorrow. Answer it when you feel like it. Um, and I would do things like, you know, I would call her to check on her, but I would wait till I had to leave the house in 10 minutes. And then I would start the call by saying, hey, mom, I only got 10 minutes, but I want to see how you're doing. And it put an automatic timer on the thing. And when the 10 minutes is up, I said, sorry, I got to go. I'll talk to you later. And that kind of stuff, I never, until I took the time away and got the distance and got myself separate from her, it never occurred to me that I had the option to set any parameters on anything. I would sit there for an hour, clenching my jaw, you know, feel like I was driven crazy on the phone with her. And then I'd feel like garbage for 2 days because I didn't know that I could put limits on it because that wasn't part of the contract that she had established with me when I was little.
Yeah. Yeah. When you talk about being young and turning to your mother, trying to keep her happy, I think that's, for me, I did the same thing. All the terms you're using, I really relate to them. Being the golden child at one point and later becoming, you know, some kind of pariah in the family because I speak up.
A scapegoat.
Yeah, the scapegoat. And
Yeah.
and then also just being that, it's like being, you know, I don't know if I like using the term for myself because it's uncomfortable, but just considering myself as a gifted child, then I knew how to better manage my mother's emotions than perhaps the other kids in my family did. And so I never had the challenges that they had from a discipline perspective, getting in trouble, punishment, that kind of thing. And I had a lot of praise put on me. One of the things that my mom would do is she would whisper in my ear, "You're my favorite." And she would tell me that I was the best. And then later, when the other kids in my family would bring this up, like in our teenage years, they would kind of complain about this type of situation. You know, when I tried to set boundaries with my mom, she turned around and she used that against me. She said, well, you always acted like you were better than everybody else. And so, you know, as a kid, what am I supposed to do if you're going to control me like that? But it was the same kind of thing that you're describing, where she had some kind of prescribed identity for each of her children. And then she expected each one of them to play that role. And if you didn't play that role, then you were punished, either, you know, emotionally, distance, or even physically, literally. And so I did, similar to you, I got to a point where I just had to, in my mid 30s, I had to cut off my mother. And so at this point in my life, I don't have interactions with her because of the same thing, that at a young age, her emotional manipulation created such a relationship where I always felt like it was my job to keep her happy, to please her. And
Right.
so similar to what you're saying, I would spend, I'd see her on the holidays. It would take me a week to recover emotionally and physically.
That's a tell right there. That's a tell. If you're a man or a woman, but since I deal principally with men, if you're a man who has a story like that, then you've got a mother wound that is not been attended, and it is gonna f up your life.
Yeah. You could swear. It's okay. Swearing's okay.
It'll fuck up your life. It'll fuck up your relationships. You
Yeah.
will not be able to achieve your potential because you're somebody's servant. And I'll say this too, and I'll just talk about myself. You can tell me if this is true for you or not. My mother's emotional manipulation of me taught me to be emotionally manipulative. That's how I
Yes.
manage.
Yes.
Yeah, and ooh, I hate to admit that.
Yeah.
I think I'm better now. But I didn't know for a long time. Like I was kind of a passive aggressive nightmare in some of my early relationships because I never learned. I certainly with my father, I couldn't speak up and say, well, I don't like that. Um, because that, you know, then the big boat anchor would drop on me, and with my mother, it was like, no, and I'd be like, shit, I better not do that.
Yeah.
So I really felt trapped in the version of me that she had created for herself. Um, but again, one of the side effects of it was that it was difficult for me, impossible. I didn't know how to state my needs. And, again, going back to earlier in the conversation, one of those first men's groups I was in, the facilitators would often ask at various points when men were talking, well, what do you need right now? And the men would just be dumbfounded. Like they didn't know how to answer the question.
Yeah.
Because, despite a lot of popular uh, uh, stories about how men get everything they want and it's all about men, a lot of men come out of their childhoods, just not being able to, they don't know how to state what they need because they can't even answer the question to themselves because they've been trained out of it. And so these are just some of the things that result from this kind of mother wound, the way that I've defined it.
Yeah. The way that you describe learning, like being manipulated, so knowing how to manipulate, it really
Mhm.
resonates with me. And what I experienced was not just in relationships with women, but in relationships in general. It always felt like every time I'm interacting with somebody, there's some kind of a hierarchy. Either
Yes.
either they are looking down at me or I'm looking down at them. And
Right.
it feels so icky and it feels so uncomfortable. But it was this thing where, that's how things were done. And for me, I experienced a lot of, when my fight or flight is triggered, I experienced a lot of freezing. And,
Yes.
and, um, and so I remember a lot of, especially when I was younger in, adolescent age, just being around random people who really didn't mean anything much in my life, but I might bump into them in school or through sports or something, and just not being able to engage at all in their presence, just completely shutting down. And then at the same time, just uh, then what ends up happening also is you find yourself, or what happened for me is I found myself feeling much more comfortable around people who were who also diminished themselves. And so in some way I was always feeling as if I was I was not ever in the group that I wanted to be in because I didn't really feel like I belonged in either position. And it wasn't until I was an adult and I learned all these things that you're talking about as far as my own mother wound and boundaries, where I began to see that the only relationships that I really want to be in is where everybody just gets to be themselves.
Yeah.
And so a big part of this for me was just recognizing who in my life took that energy from me. When I spent time with them,
Ah,
did I come away feeling energized or did I come away feeling drained, either because I felt that they were somehow manipulating me through emotions or I was somehow getting the best of them? Either way, I just didn't want to be part of that. And so after setting a boundary with my parents, or basically like, hey, we're not going to communicate. Then it was a process of years of trying a new approach with almost every one of my friends, where I had to reach out and say, hey, can I talk to you about some things? And there were a number of them where I was pleasantly surprised, where I do have a number of friends who were able to go to places with me, like my depths, and be there with me in a way that we both felt safe. And it was overall positive for the relationship. But the majority of people that I tried to do this with, I found that I was sharing with them who I was and what had shaped me in a way that all of a sudden I found that I had to comfort them. And that energy was just being sucked from me in a way where I thought, oh geez, like I have all these imbalanced relationships, and I've really had to, I've had to set boundaries with more than just my mother and my father.
Yeah. Well, that's part of it. There are, in terms of other relationships, you you know you develop yourself out of the person that they thought they were in a relationship with. So, there's we about the term, you've heard of the term covert contracts before, probably, right?
Yeah.
So, like, the idea is that we enter into a relationship with somebody, and we sort of have this unstated understanding of who each of us is going to be, and how each of us is going to act, and what the limits are, and all that kind of stuff. And some people, just that's important to them. That's like essential to their sense of security in a relationship, that things do not change. Uh, but if you go through the kind of processes that I've talked about, the kind of process that you're talking about, you're not going to be the same after that. And it's either going to be annoying to the other person, or it's going to be annoying to you, unless they're moving down some kind of parallel track.
Right.
It doesn't have to be the same, that allows them to cultivate that kind of openness, and also sort of enables them to understand that they have to take care of their own feelings, just like you do. But again, that's not how most of us are trained, at all. And so you wind up with these imbalances that are actually built in to the relationship. And sometimes, as you said, sometimes the relationship can actually transcend that, and you sort of like revise the contract as you go, and it becomes more expansive and more accepting. But sometimes the relationships just can't withstand the change.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you talk about you are different, for me, my experience is not just thinking differently, but feeling completely differently inside my body, just feeling like a completely different person. That pit that was always in my stomach was no longer there. And so then I just felt so much more assertive. I felt so much more sure of what I wanted. And if people weren't willing to give it to me, then okay, that's fine. A big part of it for me was, and this is when I tried to have the conversations with my mother, one of the things that I got from my parents, her and my father, was this idea that you have to accept people for who they are.
Right.
And I said, okay, yes, I can accept people. It's true. You do have to accept people for who they are, because you can't change people. But the reality of that is that once you accept people for who they are, that doesn't mean that you have to continue with the same relationship. Sometimes accepting people for who they are means that you move on.
Right. Right. And I think trust is a big issue here too. This is something I've had one of the most challenging years this year, emotionally and psychologically, in my entire life. And one of the things that, because I have a tendency, maybe you do too, I'm sure other people do, if something's not working with somebody a relationship that you really cherish and that you really value, or if it breaks and you're in the aftermath of it, or if you're leading up to the breakage, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out, what is that other person thinking? What does it mean when they do this? What do I need to do instead? Am I not doing the right thing? And is that why it all happened? And then speculating in the aftermath. And the thing I've come to realize is, like, the fundamental thing for me is, like, do I trust this person and this relationship or not? Because if I don't, then whatever stories I'm trying to make up about what happened really don't matter. It's just crystallized for me this year. It's like, if I don't trust you, then I don't want to be in a relationship with you.
Yeah.
And that can, how do I determine that? Well, if I see a pattern, it's not like somebody screws up one time and I'm like, I don't trust you anymore. It's like, It has to be a pattern of ghosting, gaslighting, deception, manipulation, where I can actually see the pattern. And typically, up to this point in my history, at least, I really have to see that for a long time before I'm ready to just cut somebody, out. I don't like doing it. I prefer not to, and and there's a cost that's involved when you say, okay, I'm not going to do this relationship anymore because whatever potential you might have thought that the relationship had, you have to grieve that if it's an important relationship. It's not just the loss of what you had, it's the loss of what you expected to have.
Yeah. Yeah. And particularly, I mean, the biggest one probably is that mother relationship. Like what you said earlier, coming to terms with the idea that you will never have the mom that you want, the mom
Right.
that you desire. I've had
Right.
that same thought. I've been saying that to myself for a couple of years now. And it's a hard one because when I think about the connection to mother from a, if you think about it from even from a biological perspective,
Right.
being having been part of this person at one point,
Yes.
literally,
That's right.
and then us being mammals, us being some kind of evolved primate. um the the thing with mammals is the emotion that we have with a mother figure is such that we can't, literally cannot survive without this person, in
True.
our early years. And so
Yes.
then to move forward into life realizing that this person is not what you thought she was, or she can't be who you hope she is, or wish she is.
Yeah.
uh yeah, that's a hard one to grieve. Do you have what advice do you have for, let's say somebody has gotten to the point where they're aware of this in their own life, this idea that, maybe their mother wasn't what they really needed, and so there is a wound there. What advice do you have for somebody who's at that point?
Well, I think anything that you can do is as uncomfortable as it is, anything that you can do to begin to develop your relationship with that wound. How does it show up in your life? As we said earlier, how do you feel after you've had a phone call or a visit? And are you willing to continue like that? Or are you at a point where you will experience whatever pain you have to experience to transcend that situation, and let go of that person? Because it's not, I mean, we need to do this for ourselves, right? As opposed to anybody else. But one of the things I learned is that um, it's actually quite unfair and unethical for me to require somebody else to be the way I want them to be.
Yeah. And you can't change them or make them be who you want them to be anyways.
No, and it's not ethical. I mean, I don't want people to do that to me. That's part of what I'm pushing back against, right? Is that she wanted and needed me to be a certain way. It's like, well, I'm not that way, you know. So, but I was also doing that to her, and so I think there's, you know, anything you can do also to begin to see that person as another individual, another adult that is not just your parent. So one of the things I encourage people to do is like learn about if you don't know much about their early life, do what you can to learn about what their life was like before you showed up. Uh, because I know I always had this, I knew rationally that, yeah, my parents existed before I showed up, but there was a part of me in like my inner narrative, it was like, no, their lives started with me. And that's just not true,
Hmm.
you know. That's very childlike. So a big part of this is to determine when you have feelings of, for example, if you have feelings of resistance about getting distance from your mother, how old is the part of you that's experiencing that? Because we can think at an adult level and get nowhere if there are younger aspects of ourselves that are really, really stuck on getting what they wanted. So that was one of the biggest obstacles that I had to deal with. Is like there were younger parts of me that were like, when I'd say, I'm never going to have that mother I wanted, to be like, no, 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 no way, not giving up, So there are different ways I use with clients to get in touch with those earlier parts of themselves. One way is that I'll ask somebody to do a drawing, you know, make a drawing of what kind of mother your 6-year-old wanted to have, and then we'll look at it together. And the great thing about doing drawings is that you bypass your verbal filters. And you sort of, especially if you're no good, not very, I won't say no good, especially if your technical skills as an artist are not very well developed, you're going to come from kind of a 6-year-old place when you make the drawing. And so it is, I think it's imperative that we deal with our younger selves and what they wanted and what they're still hanging on to, because they determine a lot of our thoughts, a lot of our behaviors. As I said earlier, how old is the resistance, inside you? And it's also useful to look at the age of the parts of you that are unhappy with the relationship and why. So, another thing I do often with clients is I'll say, okay, you know, have your 6-year-old or your 15-year-old write a letter, um, as if he was writing it to your mother. What would he say? And these are all ways to just like kind of get stuff up to the surface where we can see them, and actually put them in the right sort of context in terms of, is it really me, as a grown man that needs this woman in this way, or is it an earlier part of me that just has a lot of unfinished business that she's not going to help him finish? I have to find another way to do it.
Yeah, I think about creativity a lot. I mean, especially that's kind of the phase of my life that I'm in now. And so when you talk about drawing, maybe it's painting, maybe it's clay,
Painting.
whatever it is.
Yeah. Mhm.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately in my own life, but also just in books that I've been reading. People like Joseph Campbell and Karen Armstrong, who essentially what they're doing is laying out the history of religion and another way to think about that is the history of human psychology.
Right.
And what it used to be like in the past is that societies would have rituals that took children from the stage of childhood, and through this ritual, it usually they're really painful and traumatic themselves. But what it did was it forced them out of the childlike state into an adult state. And it seems in our society today that we don't have that ritual anymore. There is no, people might graduate high school, they might graduate college, maybe they go through a bat mitzvah or something, but it really doesn't do what these ancient rituals used to do, where it would turn them into something else. And it would, in a way, it would free them from some of these childhood things. And so in our day, a lot of what we can do is turn to the arts, turn to the creative side of ourselves. So I've experienced it in my own life. It sounds like what you're describing is the same thing. These authors and scholars, Joseph Campbell and Karen Armstrong, Carl Jung, they all talk about the modern process of individuation, growth, maturation, healing, whatever you want to call it. It all requires some form of personal creative venture, personal creative energy. And so you sit down with a blank piece of paper and you start drawing, or you start painting, or you build something, even if it's Legos, it doesn't matter, but just sitting down and actually letting some creative juices flow out of you. If you do it enough, and if you do it kind of in the right, with the right intentions, I think that creative process alone is the modern ritual that helps people move from this childlike state into an adult state where you can, like you're saying, it's easy enough for us to use our minds to think in adult ways. But what we're combating is this emotion in our bodies that's still stuck in a childlike state. And that emotion needs to get out. It needs to be processed in order for that part of us to mature beyond that stage. It's as if there are parts of us that are literally stuck in childhood. And so we can't react in a way that's adult enough. And, for me personally, it's mostly been writing, but also just drawing, sitting down with a pencil. And I think that's the modern way that we do it. That's the modern way that we move from childhood to adulthood, is our creative energies.
Well, I had a couple of thoughts, Kurt, while you're talking. Number one is, before I forget it, in the Catholic Church, there's the First Communion, which I was very clear about as a child, and then there was something called confirmation, which I had no idea what that was about. I didn't know what it was for. I just knew it was something that we were supposed to do. I don't know if any of my friends understood what it was about, I didn't know that that was supposed to be the transition into adulthood until I saw Joseph Campbell talking on the Power of Myth series in my early 30s. I was like, oh, that's what that was for. So that's how divorced the rituals have become from any sort of meaning. Um, and even in my generation, I'm a bit older than you, quite a bit. We did have some ritual passages to adulthood. It's like I remember the first job I got mowing lawns. I remember buying my first car. I remember getting my driver's license. I remember, all those sorts of things. Well, a lot of people in their teens and now into their 20s, they never really had a job until they got out of college. So they didn't cross that threshold. They, I've got, I know young people they're getting up into their late teens or early 20s before they even get a driver's license. So that even the markers that were there when I was growing up for current generation, not necessarily there. So that just opens it up into this sort of like free floating pool of whatever, uh, even more. And I do want to follow up on something you said too about the uh, all the things we talked about like earlier aspects of yourself kind of getting stuck in time. I'm going to share a quote from a guy named John Sarno that I like a lot. He said, "The reason childhood things are a factor is because the unconscious has no sense of time."
Yeah.
And I think you have a good sense of what that's all about.
Yeah, I think that's also why it's so difficult to deal with this mother wound. Usually it probably comes up in people's late 20s, but more like their mid 30s, where they
Mhm.
really are ready to deal with it. And that's one of the big challenges, is that from an experiential perspective, it's been years since we got our driver's license. It's been years since we graduated high school. We've been adults taking care of ourselves for a long time, and there's still this child inside of us that's grieving, that hasn't moved on. And
Right. A
that's,
child and a middle schooler
yeah.
and preteen and a teen. That's one of the things I work on a lot too, is like people tend to think of inner child work as like, okay, anywhere from baby to about 7 or 8, and wow, there's a big span there, between 8 years old and 18, and there's a lot that goes on. And I typically find that because I learned this with myself, there are typically two sort of dominant ages that are really pushing buttons and pulling levers in there. One is like somewhere like 6, 7. The other one is like 13, 14, 15. And I've actually started realizing myself is like 13 is not the same as 15. There's actually two of them there that are very unique. And so that's a lot of the work that I do with my clients as well, is like, how can we establish communication? Because I'll often ask clients, okay, send me a photo of yourself when you were like 6 to 7 years old. Send me a photo of yourself when you're 13 and one when you're 15 or something like that. And we look at the younger photo, and one of the first questions I'll ask is like, do you feel like this is you? And most men will say to the little one, yeah, yeah, I do. Sometimes not. Um, but when I show them the 13 or the 15-year-old, I say, do you feel like this is you? No, I don't. I know it's me rationally, but that doesn't feel like me. Because I think that's part of a function of what you talked about. It's like crossing that threshold into adulthood because we don't have a prescribed way to do it. We're not escorted across that line. One of the ways to get there is to just reject the person we were a year or two before that, and
Mm.
just like say, nope, I'm not dealing with him anymore. He's a big stupid nerd. He's shy. He's clumsy. He always gets picked last. Whatever it is. And boy, that like preteen to teen, he has a lot of power, you know. And one of my problems with like my 15-year-olds, I really like that guy. It's like that was the first time in my life I felt like I was actually an individual who was like starting to understand what I wanted and pushing back against things I didn't want. And man, I love that guy, but he should not be directing my life, you know.
Yeah, yeah. That's interesting that you say that, because when I think back, the first image that pops into my head is like my 8th grade yearbook photo. And
Mhm.
when I look back on that, I can't even remember looking in the mirror and seeing myself look like that.
Right,
It's
right.
strange. Same thing when I see a picture, I have a picture of a young version of myself. I'm probably 9 or 10 on my website. And when I see that one, I'm like, yeah, I remember being that Josh.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So those age points where you don't connect, there's an opportunity there for you to get some information from him, because they have information that we need that can help us in our lives right now, but they don't necessarily have a way to get it to us. And a lot of time, if we've neglected them for a long time, they do not trust us.
Yeah, that's a big one. Trust,
Yeah,
like the internal selves, because you talked about trusting people in external relationships, but
right.
discovering a way to get the internal selves trusting each other. Uh, that's like a whole nother rabbit hole. Which I would love to explore. We are at the hour, and so
Okay.
I want to be respectful of your time. But just to end this on a positive note, um, well, first of all, I really appreciate you sharing all this information with me, and I also just know that a lot of this is really painful for people. For myself, it's been one of the most difficult things that I've had to go through is grieving this type of a situation, this mother wound. But just to say that if you're willing to go through it, there is a bright light at the other end of the tunnel where you do come out of it no longer feeling a lot of the negativity that you felt before, the fatigue, the pit in your stomach, the nervousness around people. A lot of that just goes away, and you just feel more like the way I would describe it is I feel more whole. I feel more
Yeah.
present. I feel more like I'm in charge of my life. And another thing that it's done for me is when you're willing to sit with all the different ways that you've been manipulated or even just treated, all of a sudden you can see the unconscious patterns in all these people around you,
Yep.
and coupling that with the desire to not manipulate people anymore, it it leads to a sense of compassion in a lot of ways, where either you're going to find a way to interact with them and have compassion with them, or you're going to find a way to move away from them and have compassion for yourself. And that's been a huge, I would say, blessing or even miracle that's taken place in my life.
Right. Right. Yeah. It is. I mean, you have to pay for it, though. You have to be willing to pay in some very uncomfortable emotional experiences and psychological experiences. You can do it, but you got to give yourself time. And I have clients come to me like they're in their 50s, and they're like, "Why did it take me so long to get to this point?" And it's like, well, you have to have some life experience. You have to have some external reference points that you didn't have before. You have to have, to some extent, you have to like have individuated away from the family system, not completely, but at least enough so that you have a sense of who you are away from that.
Yeah.
And it.
Yeah, I would also say that you don't actually get to decide when the process starts. What happens is that you do some of those things that you're describing, and you end up in a place in your life where suddenly the psyche says, "Okay, it's time." Like the psyche feels comfortable enough, the psyche feels safe enough or prepared, and your unconscious self is going to take the leap long before you're ready, or like before you're consciously aware ready.
I agree with that, and I also have had this experience, or I guess I've kind of developed this idea for myself of like, I come into every situation with a bucket of energy that's finite, and when I hit the bottom of that thing, because nothing's refilling it, it's just all coming out. Then it's just like I can feel it physically. It's like I can't do this anymore. You know,
Yeah.
just can't do it. My body won't do it. And then what? Well, then you have to address whatever factors have kept you in it this long, even though your bucket was being emptied.
Yeah, and I would also say that one thing that I repeat to myself all the time is just to remind myself that all great things take time. And
Mhm.
it's just that's the journey of the life of a lifetime, is to actually figure this stuff out. So there is no point at which it's done. You just got to keep putting in the time and keep putting in the time.
Yep. And you have to be willing to let like your older self die in some way. That's where a lot of the pain comes. That's where a lot of the grief comes.
Yeah.
Like I talked about this. I'm very attached to my 15-year-old. I don't want him to die. But like a lot of it is about the relationship or the context around it. We tend to think of if a relationship breaks up and, well, I miss this person and all this stuff. It's like, yeah, but a lot of what you miss is the feeling that you had when you were in that situation, or the hope, like I said earlier, or the fantasy of what it's going to be. And that stuff, there is a sort of death that you have to process uh, in those situations. It's not physical death, but it's the death of an idea. It's the death of a hope, a death of a dream. And that's when you say, that's why when you say, I'm never going to have that mother I wanted, you're talking about saying, okay, I'm accepting that dream that I had since I was a little boy is dead. And that's a hell of a thing for the little boy to accept. He needs a lot of help.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I guess a lot of acceptance, right? Just accepting, kind of getting to a Buddhist state where just you see things as they are and you're not projecting some story outward anymore, and you just have to you have to live with life as it actually is.
But you can't skip over the crying and the slobbering and all that stuff. You have to do that first.
Yeah,
You and I are not that evolved. We can't jump straight over to the Buddha state.
Yeah,
You
that is
know?
the starting point, yeah, or the process. It's like the burning up of the old.
Yep. So if we have time, are you interested in me sharing one of my poems I've written about my experience with motherhood?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear it.
Okay. Let me go. I've got some stuff queued up here, so let me grab it. Okay. And this goes to a lot of the issues I think that we've discussed already. So this poem is called "The Grief I Will Not Let Myself Feel." I've never grieved my first love, the one who brought me here. Never cried for losing her, never shed a tear. The grief I will not let myself feel for her occupies its own universe within me. It has its own culture, its own history, its own language, its own physics. It recreates itself automatically and repeatedly in the outer world. The grief I will not let myself feel for her is epic, mythic, immense as the Milky Way, but it's lost somewhere far inside me, like a ghost ship with a broken compass, traveling in endless circles in a dense fog. The grief I will not let myself feel for her is buried in the safety of anger. I hold that anger tight in my teeth. I use it to try to plug the lifetime of holes she's left in my psyche, but the pain keeps leaking out. The grief I will not let myself feel for her is deep, profound, and frightening. It's the monster under the bed, the shark stalking the swimmer, the mugger waiting in a dark alleyway. It's a hydra tree with heads for leaves and tangled roots that she set like fishhooks in my embryonic heart. The grief I will not let myself feel for her is locked up high in the tower of a castle with a drawbridge guarded by an infant. He guards that gate with his life because he knows that my entry into the tower of unfelt grief means the end of her, and he's convinced he can't live without her and doesn't want to.
Wow. That I think that pretty much sums up the that lifelong, I don't know, that pain or that grief that comes with it. So
This is the challenge,
yeah.
right? You have to meet that needy infant or that needy 6-year-old or that needy 12-year-old. You have to meet him and somehow negotiate your way past him and bring him with you.
Yeah. Well, Rick, I'm grateful that you've put in so much work on yourself, and I'm grateful that you're willing to share it with other people. And I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today.
Yeah, it's been great. I love to be able to talk about these things. I'd like to get, I'd like to get more people talking about these things because I think it's needed. And
Yeah. Yeah,
men have a
absolutely.
lot of unmet needs in this culture and this system right now, and it's just causing a lot of things to crash. So I think it's urgent that we begin to expand our view of what a man's inner life is like and what actually drives the things that we see on the outside.
Yeah, and just a view of what masculinity or healthy masculinity looks like, something that's much more balanced and has, that strong assertive side, but also the compassionate, gentle side.
Yeah, it's about, you know, even though we're talking about a wound here, and people talk about healing their wounds and all that, that's important. But I think you have to expand it beyond that. It's like we're really talking about developmental stages that weren't completed, that lead you into a place where you continue to mature. And mature masculinity is what we would like to see in every man, because that's where the accountability, the discernment, the responsibility come into play when it comes to expressing masculine power in a safe way that benefits everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And well said. Okay, so Rick, where can people find you online? Where can they find your work, books, poetry, website?
Sure. My main website, my legacy website is rickbelden.com, and that's sort of the central place where you can get access to other sites that I have, my YouTube channel, various things that I've posted over time on some of these topics. And my coaching website is rickbeldencoaching.com. And for those listening who might be interested in coaching, I offer a free 30-minute discovery session. So you can get on my schedule there at rickbeldencoaching.com if you'd like to continue this discussion with me.
Okay, thank you. And thanks again for talking with me.
Thanks, Josh. It's been great.